Hello and welcome to the Car Care channel, and welcome back to the Toyota Supra, or like some of you like to call it, BMW Supra. And you will be correct, this is a BMW, the beautiful Supra body. But in 2023 we now have a manual transmission. So let's recap how Toyota have really done this in a very interesting way alongside BMW. So the first year it made less power, and then it made more power with no manual transmission, and then all of a sudden in 2023 we have a manual transmission. It's not the ideal way to do this, because now people that have bought the earlier ones, the loyalists, the ones that jumped in and bought the launch edition, they got the least one, and the later ones are better in a way. In today's video, we're going to check out the manual transmission. We'll talk about it. We'll kind of revisit the drivetrain of the Supra now with a manual transmission and everything else in between right after this. Let's talk about some technical specifications under the hood, even though we've really reviewed the Supra before. But let's recap the things that are good. Some things are pretty interesting here. But this is the 3.0 B58 BMW engine, and they make absolutely no effort to hide this. There's BMW written everywhere here, because it's straight out of a BMW. Then there's another engine in the Supra, which is the B48. 2-liter, 4-cylinder. For lack of a better word, it is exactly the same as this engine, just with 2 cylinders less. A little bit more space in the front to replace all the plastic stuff that are going to break in the future. Hopefully not. But the B58 is a very interesting engine. BMW, for the longest time, have made good inline sixes. Not the best. Reliability-wise, that's not their thing. But they made really good inline sixes. The truth have to be said. Their V8s, some of them are not great, but back to the B58. This is a very interesting engine because it's very German. There is nothing more German than this. The mechanical construction of this is what's interesting. Plastic valve cover. The timing chain is in the back of the engine, so anything you want to do, you have to pull the engine out of the car. Except, and this is very interesting, if you want to change the timing gears on this engine, there's an extremely complicated process to do that, and something that will make many non-German car technicians sweat a lot. Normally, in normal cars, the timing gear has a pin or a guide pin that guides this gear to sit in exactly the right spot on the camshaft. Very simple. You line it up, click, put the bolt, we're done. This does not have that. So you set the crank at a specific position, you put a bolt to lock it, then you put the cams at a specific position before you take it apart, lock the cams with a special tool, and then put a specific tool where the chain tensioner is after you've replaced your gears and they're still loose, and then you put that special tensioner and tighten the gears and hope for the best. It always works. It's of course engineered to work, but it's very nerve-wracking and a very interesting design. And then other stuff about this engine, it is turbocharged. It does have a single turbo, actually a pretty sizable turbo, and you do notice the lag in this. The other thing is there is a lot of complication here. I mean, BMW sure does know how to complicate an engine. Let's talk about some of the highlights though. This has a very clever valve train. It is like not just variable valve timing, it has valve lift. So did you know that there are times when you're driving in your Supra and the throttle is wide open even at idle, because it can really make that intake valve open so little that it'll keep the car idling with the throttle open fully. And it'll actually control the RPM with the valve lift instead of the throttle body, which is something very interesting. When you see that in action, it is something fascinating. Another thing about the turbo, it is coolant and oil cooled, of course. That's pretty standard with turbos these days. But the other thing is the intercooler is integrated into the intake manifold. And that's one of the changes they made to make this engine from the early years to the later ones to make more power. So the intercooler lives inside the intake manifold. It is part of it, and it is liquid cooled. So there is not a lot of piping here. I mean, Basically, it's straight pipe from the turbo outlet into the intake manifold, because that's where the intercooler is. It's a very efficient, compact package. And then the cooling system is a little bit on the complicated side. So there is a separate cooling system for the intercooler, and then there's another one for the engine. The engine does have a water pump, mechanical one, but it has a distribution valve that sends the coolant where it needs to go, and it's a very clever on paper, but very complicated in reality. It can cool the block separate from the cylinder head, and that is something pretty interesting. And there's another interesting fact about the Supra, and it's going to shock some of you. Did you know that the Toyota Supra in 2020 was the first ever Toyota, that is not really a Toyota, to have LAN communication for its OBD2? All other Toyotas, by the time this came out in 2020, just had regular CAN network. This uses LAN network, which is, computer guys will know that is a lot faster than CAN. And the statistics on this, and I remember the technical training when this came out, if you leave the key on with the scan tool connected and the communication is happening, I remember it was something like 18 minutes, the giant battery will go flat. That's just how much electronics there are in this and how much is happening behind the scenes. And apparently BMW does something pretty interesting. It was just, we had to stop our Toyota mentality as technicians and kind of switch the mode, because this car does not have an off mode per se. In Toyotas, when you kill the ignition, everything is dead. That's it. You physically kill power to things. Certain computers will stay alive, but at a very minimal capacity. This, you turn the key off, everything is still alive, and things are happening in the background. Because only when the computer, it's kind of like your Windows computer, when you hit shutdown, it takes a minute for it to everything shutting down. This is the same way, and things will stay alive up to 15 minutes. That's why this thing has a massive battery in the back and is heavily monitored. There is a lot to like here, folks. Tunability here is very high, and there are a few things that are kind of BMW specials, I suppose. So most engines, the direct injection is right on the side, directly into the cylinder head, and that's how it is, especially the case with Toyota. This one, the direct injectors are literally right next to the ignition coils on the top. So every time you pull the valve cover on one of these, you have to get a very special tool to pull the rails and pull the direct injectors, which are plastic, of course, and they love to break. Ask me how I know that. So that was perhaps not the best idea in the planet, but it is nonetheless an interesting design. I really haven't seen a lot of manufacturers use this design, but again, we are talking about BMW. Let's talk about the transmissions before we take this for a drive and see how the manual transmission behaves. The Supra can have two possible transmissions. One of them is an 8-speed automatic, which is actually a very good transmission, the truth have to be said. It's a ZF transmission used in a lot of makes and models. The only thing about it that is interesting is that transmission disengages the park pole hydraulically. So when you lose hydraulic pressure, it engages park over time. They say you have about half an hour for that to happen. So far, up to this point in 2023, reliability on that transmission has been good, except the first year. They do have some oil leaks from the oil pan. That was pretty common. But otherwise, they've been holding pretty good. The manual transmission is very new, and it is also a ZF transmission. Here's the code designation for that, but Toyota's calling it the L500. I don't know why they called it that. It does have a designation from ZF. It is a ZF transmission. It, in a different variation, different ratios, is used in some BMW and other models. But for the Supra, it was actually a unique kind of one-off setup, because Toyota wanted to kind of tune that transmission on their own, and they, I think, did a pretty good job. It's very lively. It's a beautiful manual transmission. Shifts very smooth. The clutch feels just has the right feel. Some cars, like in my opinion, the GR86 doesn't really have a good feeling clutch. This has a proper feeling clutch, which is a pleasure to drive. Speaking of the drive, let's go drive the Supra and we'll check out that manual transmission. Let's take the Toyota Supra manual transmission for a drive. So right now the parking brake is engaged. As soon as you put it in first and you take off, the parking brake disengages on its own, which is pretty cool. We are in sport mode, which is, I think, the normal mode that you should always drive the Supra at. So the one thing about this manual transmission, and it has to be said, it is such a smooth shifting transmission. I mean, it's effortless to shift. And as far as power loss and turbo lag and all that, you don't really feel it. And that's the IMT. We're going to talk about that in a bit. But I mean, let's take off and try to keep it within the speed limit. Pretty smooth shifting transmission. Usually when you push manual transmissions, that's when they'll bind when you're shifting fast. But this one, it's proper, and I really like that. The other thing is, if you take it out of sport mode, and the seatbelt stops choking me, it's a normal civilized car. Very easy to drive, very soft clutch. But when you need it to, and let's listen to that IMT. Now we're in 5th gear. Very smooth shifting transmission. Now in the automatic transmission in the Supra, every time you let go of the gas, it starts crackling. That's very important for car people. So in the manual, if you just shift, it won't do it. But here's how you make it do it. 3rd gear, it's downshift in 2nd. It's still possible. It's not going to be crackling all day long like the automatic one every time you lift off, but unless you drive it really, and this is actually not good for the drivetrain to keep accelerate but let go. That's not good for it, but you can still make a crackle here and there in the track. But this transmission is just beautiful. I really like the ratios are distributed well. So 5th gear is direct drive. You feel it when you go into 5th gear. It kind of, everything becomes, I don't know how to describe it, maybe this is a mechanics thing, but I always feel direct drive. It is 5th gear, so it gives you a lot of gears that are under drive and just one is overdrive, which is almost standard with manual transmissions, but this one, very smooth transmission. And the IMT works pretty good. Not my personal favorite, but I do see the need for it, where you're driving, just shut off sport mode and you just have a normal downshift. It immediately revs it up. It's pretty fast and pretty accurate. I really like that. Folks, this car is beautiful to drive. It is comfortable. Yes, the seats can be a little bit too bolstered, but overall it's not too bad. It's very comfortable. And in the manual transmission, you know, usually cars with manual transmission, they're not as smooth, they're not as, you know, there's the shakiness of the whole shifting and everything. But this one, I can see myself taking a very long road trip in this because it's a very smooth transmission, so easy to shift. The clutch just feels perfect. I really, really like this. And almost all, the exception of one, all the Supras that I've owned before have been manual transmissions, and this one really lives up to the promise of the Supra. It's going to put a giant smile on your face. And if you're going to semi-drive this every day and you go with the automatic is good as well. It's not a slow, sluggish transmission like the previous Supras. No, it's a good 8-speed, and this one is the one to get, in my opinion. It's so good. I love it. Let's do a walk around the outside and the inside of the Toyota Supra. Something I have to be said about this is a beautiful car. And even though it's a BMW Supra and all that, Toyota did design the outside, and they did a really good job. I think this represents what the Supra was and is. You look at this front end, it has this front, like everything is pointing towards the front. It just has a proper look. It's very low to the ground. It does have kind of this lip that is integrated, and then it kind of comes up. I love the design of the Supra, and of course the fake vents, and more fake vents here. It's something they love to do. And then the cool thing about this car, it has like a bulge here that gives it kind of a muscular design, and there's really not a fender on the side. It's just this little panel here, and that's it. The rest is just this massive, extremely expensive hood. So be careful with these. And then the mirror on this one, it brings all the car guys in or 9-year-old. The carbon fiber mirror, it's an option. And another fake vent here for yeah, they love to do that. We'll talk about that in a bit. But something interesting is, I always loved this, except when it comes to service. This does get in your way when you want to lift this car, but it just gives it a very cool character. And I love the other bulge here. This is just a beautiful looking car, it has to be said. Now the bubble roof, a lot of people dislike it, but it does make entering and exiting this car hard. But once you're inside, it does give you more headroom, and that was the intent of this. Could have made this pillar a little bit higher so you can have a better entry, but it would have changed the side profile design, because it is a very iconic look for the Supra to have this quarter glass here. Now, the trunk, there is something about, or the hatch, or whatever you want to call it, there's something very interesting here. There is no button to open this, not here, not the badge, nothing. You have to take out your key, or you have to open it inside. That's one thing they did that was not very nice. Then when we look here, it is roomy for a car of this size, but this bulge here really makes entrance hard. And underneath this cover and this cover is, well, this is kind of a fun one to remove. You have to kind of go this way. Is the massive 910 cca or 950 cca, correction, 12-volt battery, which is enormous, and it sits very low in the car. And this battery, just imagining that this battery would die in such a quick time when you leave the key on with the computer communicating with the scan tool, it's just tells you how much there is in this car. This is a truly beautiful looking car, and this is credit to Toyota, because BMW gave them everything else. The design of the body was Toyota, and they did it really well. I love the taillights. I really love this car. I love the this is one of the parts that says Toyota on it. There's very few parts in this car that actually says the word Toyota on the part itself. That's one of them. Some of you mentioned in previous videos some of the interior parts, but I can tell you from service side, these, if you take these belt moldings out in the back, somewhere around this area, they'll be stamped Toyota. Not the badge, just written Toyota, which is pretty interesting. But let's take a look at the inside of the Supra with the manual transmission. This is a typical Supra interior with a manual transmission. Couple things I have to say about this manual transmission. I've owned older Supras, and the one mod that everybody used to do to them is a short throw shifter. Well, this already has it. It's a pretty short throw shifter, beautiful 6-speed transmission. It's an interesting pattern, at least for Toyota line, because we're used to this being reversed, but this is 6 gear. So you push the transmission to the side and up, that is reverse. Everything else on the inside of this car remains exactly the same. I do like this interior. There are a couple things that are interesting about it. This raised part right here that closes off the drivers, usually it's the other way around to kind of give the driver their cockpit view, but this kind of plays against that. That is one thing. Everything here is 100% BMW. Infotainment system, 100% BMW. The climate control, although it's the good BMW, I suppose, because you do have physical button. It's not the newest BMW design that they came out with the 7 Series. Everything is not touch button anymore. But the infotainment screen looks like it was an add-on, and I wish there was a way to kind of take it out, because if you look at the dash line right here, like you see the line, and then this thing is just sitting here, and I wish it would have been flat. If there was an option, or this hides away or something, it would have looked cooler. But no complaints. The interior is very nice. But there is something about the Supra, in case you didn't know. The parking brake engages in the manual transmissions. For whatever reason, if there's something wrong with the clutch, you cannot actually start this car without pressing the clutch. That is by design. However, if you press the start button 3 times, the car enters diagnostic mode and then you can disengage the parking brake, which is a cool thing. But there's something very interesting about this transmission that I see in a lot of cars. So if you look at the gauge, we're in neutral right now. If I shift it into first, it immediately changes. Second, you can even see the third in between, because most manual transmissions that have a screen that show you this, it will be done via the sensors on the transmission. The computer will rapidly calculate the ratio from the input and output shaft sensors, and it'll tell you which gear you're in. But this, it actually shows you on the screen immediately, even when you're stopped, which means they have a sensor here that picks up which gear you're in, which is pretty cool because it's immediate and you see it right away. I thought that was pretty cool that they added that. Let's take a look underneath the 23 Supra manual transmission. Everything is very covered up, and something that BMW loves to do, this shield and these bolts, this is actually a structural piece. You're not supposed to drive this car without the shield, and every time you take these bolts, you're supposed to replace them. That's just the BMW way. And over here you have a little opening that has the drain plug for the engine. It's 17 millimeter with insulation right next to it. So the joke is when it leaks oil, that will soak up the oil, you won't see it dripping. Let's look at the front suspension here. Everything is aluminum here. Aluminum knuckle, 2 control arms at the bottom. There's no control arms at the top because the strut sits right into the knuckle at the top. The only thing that is steel, of course, is your sway bar. The only downside of having an aluminum knuckle is if you ever have to replace a bearing when this thing gets older, the steel bearing will weld itself from dissimilar metals. But I guess the BMW won't last that long, so we don't have to worry about that. The front caliper is a 4-piston caliper. It's a pretty large caliper. They're actually huge pads for this one, which is pretty cool. They do say BMW on them. I wonder if Brembo has something to do with these calipers because they look very familiar. As we walk our way back here, you see this massive exhaust, and this does have a massive exhaust. And if you wrap around and look into this area, that is where the turbo is. You can kind of see the back of it lightly. It's actually not too bad to remove this turbo. Usually cars with turbos these days are extremely difficult to remove. And then we move back to the transmission, which is now a manual transmission. You can kind of see the edge of it. This is a ZF transmission. Pretty large size, but there's one thing that Toyota did here that's pretty interesting. They asked ZF to remove all the covering. So if you look here on the engine, you have this sound insulation covering. Here's the starter. On the transmission, there's nothing. On the automatic transmission, you do have some of that covering. On this one, you have nothing, and that was intentional. They wanted to keep the weight down of this car, not add all this insulation. And something additional to that got added for the manual transmission, this little opening here for cooling. It is pretty interesting. That is only on the manual transmission as far as my memory serves. And moving on the exhaust remains pretty similar. It is actually a high quality exhaust. German cars, specifically BMW, they usually make good quality exhaust. You can tell just by the way it feels and all the welds. Then we move over to this brace, which is pretty massive, and it goes underneath here. If you gotta remove the exhaust to do something, this brace can be interesting because you gotta remove basically half of these to get that, but that's how the BMW does things. Then the rear differential. Truth have to be said, this is a fine differential. It is a very good differential. It is cast iron, and it does have the fins in the back that are aluminum. It is an electronic limited slip differential, which is pretty, it's a very good differential, folks. BMW or not, you know, we make all these jokes about their reliability, but this is a very good differential. And then you do have covering, because when the wheels are on the ground, this will be up, so this makes the bottom almost flat. And the exhaust, pretty standard, same as before. You do have the dual tips. This one has a valve that opens, makes it louder, and it crackles, and the whole 9 yards. and pretty similar exhaust. Nothing really changed here from manual and automatic. And then the rear suspension, you do have the coil spring that is separate from the shock, and it's a multi-link setup. It's a pretty interesting setup. The knuckle is aluminum on this one. See it right here. Single piston caliper in the back with an electronic motor for the parking brake. Very interesting setup because this car handles extremely well. I mean, the truth have to be said, BMW, they do know how to make a car handle very well. The only interesting thing is they have all this covering and all that, and this area, this is where the battery sits. If you look at it, it's like an protrusion from the body. That is not covered, and you see like it's cut right here where we don't want to cover that. That's not important. That's how they do things. And there's one more thing, that when you peek underneath the car, even though it's very low, if you turn around and look at this is just an internal joke. Doesn't this look like a tiny little spark plug on your lawnmower or something? Of course, it's a sensor, it's not that, but it does have that appearance, doesn't it? Let's talk about some things I do not like about the 2023 Supra, and for that matter, the entire generation, this generation of Supras. So the first thing is, there is a confusion among this year makes less horsepower, this year makes more horsepower, then this year gets manual transmission, and what is going to come in the future. I wish they would have done this well from the beginning, where all the engines made more power, and then all the models had manual and automatic. They didn't do that, but that affects the enthusiasts and the following, because now everybody that bought one in 2020 didn't get a manual, which they might have wanted one, but now they can't. They feel disappointed, and that's how you lose your loyalty following. But more important than that, this affects all of them. You drive the Supra when the windows open, the buffeting sound is unbelievable. And this was a problem in 2020. It's okay. It's a new car. They just launched it. People found a simple solution. You put a little stickers on the mirrors and it's gone. But then 21 came around. Same thing. And 22 and 23. Can't they fix that? Something so simple? They don't. They absolutely changed nothing from the complaints about the Supra, including the fake vents all over the place. Why does a high-performance car like this has fake vents? Their initial response was, well, we left some things intentionally like that so the owners would be able to modify it. They're not modifying it at that point. They're kind of finishing what you didn't finish. That's how it feels like. And it's still disappointing when you roll up in this, which is a very serious sports car, with fake vents everywhere. They could actually serve function, but they don't here because they're fake. And lastly, this is pretty interesting to me. So specifically on the manual transmission, very good transmission, very good clutch, with a little bit of a question mark on reliability, but the IMT. So IMT is intelligent manual transmission. So basically, when you downshift, it revs up to match the revs. That's all perfectly fine. But what if you're old school? I am old school. I don't like that. I want it to go away. You have to configure your own driving setting, and then you can turn it off. What was wrong with just a button on the side that just you press it, like basically all other Toyota that had that, just a little button, you press it, it's off. Now you have to fumble through all many screens and all these settings just to turn it off. Could have done that one a little better. Folks, the manual transmission is a welcome addition to the Toyota Supra. Yes, this is a BMW, and yes, many purists, I am a Supra purist, I've owned many Supras before, have complained that why is this a BMW? Why can't Toyota make their own? They made the GR Yaris, they made the GR Corolla. Why can't they make their own car? And the answer to that question is, Toyota is a business company. They're not really an emotional company like, say, Ferrari, for example. That's an emotional company. This is a business company. BMW, they don't make reliable cars, but they make fun driving cars, and you gotta give them that because that's the truth. Why would anybody in their right mind buy a car that is a sports coupe, doesn't have back seat, that is very fast, and expect it to be reliable. I don't think there's a lot of people like that. And many will say that the previous, like third generation, fourth generation Supra, they were very reliable, but compared to other Toyotas, they were not reliable. They're not meant to be. They're meant to be fun. And this is what this car does very, very well. I had an opportunity to compare this with the Nissan Z. While the Nissan Z is epic, I think this takes a slight edge because this does feel like a Supra, but at the same time, it feels there's a hint of BMW in it that makes it very enjoyable to drive. I really like the Supra. I really like the addition of the manual transmission, but now you kind of have two good things. If you want the manual transmission, you can have it, but if you want the automatic is not bad. It's actually a very nice transmission, and this manual transmission is a good one. The clutch, a little bit of a question mark as of a recent event that happened, but that's the truth of the Supra. It's a very fun car, a little bit expensive, now with a manual transmission. Folks, I hope this video was helpful and informative. I hope you learned something new. If you like it, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you're not a subscriber, consider subscribing to the channel. Check out some of my other videos. And until the next video, folks, may the Lord bless you and keep you, and you have yourself a wonderful day.